Hello there again. It's Alistair, the Knight of the Orchards here. I'm just doing a quick preamble to this episode to let anybody know who hasn't watched the previous episode why I'm doing these. So I'm what you might call a Tolkien fan. I've read The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and most of the Unfinished Tales. And I'm just doing these episodes to give a Tolkien fan's perspective on The Rings of Power, both as a TV show and as an adaptation of Tolkien's work. These are just unedited reactions. I wanted to get it as fresh as possible, and I haven't looked at anybody else's opinions or watched any other videos on this. So this is purely just from my own knowledge of Tolkien, my own opinions, and watching the episodes. So yeah, without further ado, on with the show. Hello again, and welcome back to another Rings of Power episode recap. I'm Alistair, the Knight of the Orchards, and I think this time we'll start off with a bit of a recap of just broader themes and stuff like that, which I partly missed from the last episode and partly came up again here. So first of all, one of the things that I really like about the depiction of Sauron and sort of evil in this series thus far is that it has quite I guess, I'm not entirely sure how to say this, but I guess quite like a necromantic kind of edge to it. Unlike the Sauron of the film series, whose evil is very obvious, lots of like fire and swords and that kind of thing. Here, it's a lot more insidious. Like you've got the almost like an infection element to it. You've got kind of the black sludge and the sort of corruption that seems to indicate Sauron's presence, and the idea of him almost acting like a poison on the land, which is very much in keeping with his depiction, or just the depiction of evil in general in like the books. And actually, prior to this, the only time I'd seen it depicted like that in a similar way was actually in The Lord of the Rings Online, which does a similar thing with its depiction of Angmar and the Witch King. But yeah, so I quite like that. I like that style. Rather than the more kind of obvious fire and brimstone evil of the films, they've gone for something a bit different here. But yes, so aside from that, oh yes, and I also forgot to mention the Brandyfoot name for Nori, and is really great because obviously it's a combination of Brandybuck, which is Merry's name in the Lord of the Rings, and the Proudfoots, which also are a Hobbit clan in the Lord of the Rings. They barely appear in the films, but they appear a bit more in the books. They attend Bilbo's party. So that's quite nice. Again, kind of, it sounds different enough to the Hobbits, but also similar enough that you can kind of see, you link them together, and also, if you know where the references are, it's quite fun. But yes, so moving on to the storylines then. Nori and Poppy, I really have grown to like them. Like they weren't a huge feature of the first episode, but they're obviously a lot more present here because of their relationship to the stranger. And what I like about them is they're clearly modelled on the hobbits from the original trilogy and the relationship between the hobbits and the original book, but not to the point where it feels like a copy. I mean, Nori feels like almost a combination of maybe Pippin and Bilbo. In that she's adventurous, but also quite young and free-spirited. While Poppy feels more like a combination of Sam and Merry, in that, again, Merry from the films particularly, where they're kind of the more sensible one, but ultimately the one who does genuinely care about Nori and really wants to make sure she's doing okay. The more sensible, but also not afraid to kind of get down and help out when the need calls for it. So that was great. I liked their relationship to the stranger. Now, at the end of the last episode, I assumed the stranger would be a negative force, yeah, but Sauron maybe, or Mouth Sauron. But I think it's pretty clear at this point that the stranger won't be an overtly negative force, whether or not they are good or not. Just thinking about it, they might be doing a Maiar or a Maiai storyline with the stranger maybe being Saruman or Gandalf. That's possible. It's very different to how Gandalf and Saruman and the White Council, the Five Wizards would appear in the books, where they just take a ship from Valinor and appear in Middle-earth because, of course they would. But, fair enough if they want to do it that way, they want to do it that way. Aside from that, I can't really think of anything else it could be. So I guess we'll see. But yes, that storyline was interesting for the character moments. Obviously hasn't really gone anywhere particularly, although aside from the fact that we now know the Harfoots are probably going to have to stay put for a little while, or there's going to be some issue with Norrie's dad, so we'll see. Oh yes, and the final thing about that was the idea of Norrie being supposed to find the stranger, which of course is a direct reference to the idea that Gandalf says to Frodo that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and you were meant to have it. They've been kind of coy in the first 2 episodes about whether or not they're going to bring in the Valar and the Eru and the more overtly, not religious exactly, but kind of mythological elements of the Lord of the Rings thus far. I did think that maybe in the whole storyline with Galadriel on the raft, which we'll come to soon, I thought maybe they would introduce Ulmo and have him be the one to save Galadriel, but clearly not. So I'm assuming they're not going to have the Valar play a major role, if they play a role at all. So I think that whole storyline's probably not going to tie in the way I maybe thought it would with the stranger into the Valar directly. So talking about moving on to the raft storyline, I guess. I didn't like this one, to be honest. To start with, I was quite pleased that they didn't just have Galadriel wash up on the shore, because that would have felt cheap. But honestly, the whole storyline with the sea serpent went on way too long, and I mean, the whole thing, setting up appearing to set up yet another human elf, love story. Just don't do it. We know that Galadriel has to end up with Celeborn or Celeborn, depending on how you pronounce it, because that's her husband. So having this kind of bad boy, probably some kind of Númenorian or Númenor descendant, as some, I just didn't like it. And as my friend pointed out when we watched it together, the whole thing about it was very Titanic and it was very overwrought, and frankly, they should have just cut that storyline massively, and just had it be that she meets him once she gets back to the land. I thought it would be kind of interesting when they met the whole raft of survivors, and maybe there would be some interplay there, but no, they killed off almost all of those immediately. So yeah, I'm not a fan of that storyline, and frankly, we don't need to know much about it, except that it sets up this ongoing. We meet. I can't remember his name now, but the guy that we meet on the raft and Galadriel, and it looks like they get picked up by a Númenorian ship at the end, which of course is important because I'm assuming that we're going to have a Númenorian storyline here, although of course it's not guaranteed, but I think we probably will. It would make sense, and it would be a good way of bringing in the men, which we haven't really had as a kind of a more positive force outside from Brandwin. So moving on to that storyline then, Brandwin and the whole storyline with Rondir and Sauron, the orc. That whole sequence in the house with the orc attack was really well done. Again, I liked how the orcs, or the orc in this case, felt like an actual threat. It's in the original films, orcs don't really feel like a threat. They feel very, aside from a couple of ones like Gothmog, they just feel like cannon fodder. Whereas here, that fight with the orc was done really well. It made it clear that the orcs are actually quite dangerous, and also that it was obviously very much kind of inspired by or influenced by the raptors in the kitchen sequence from Jurassic Park, but the whole idea of them hiding in the cupboards and looking out was brilliant. The tie back into the idea of the mice under the floorboards was clever. A great action scene that also managed to keep the plot going along. I don't quite know what's going on with Rondir now. I guess we'll find out. He's probably been captured in some way. And also, I feel like the whole storyline with the Age of Peace being declared has been a bit rushed. I feel like another couple of episodes might have made that feel better, because it's weird to me that the elves seem to immediately get their orders to leave and then just leave. And I mean, Rondir even says in the previous episode that, his party will be looking for him. So if they just upped and left, like, is the Elf Tower abandoned that quickly? It just seems very odd, frankly. I feel like it would have been better to have had them set that up a bit more over maybe 2 episodes rather than just the one, to make it not feel quite so kind of truncated. In general, like, the pacing of the episodes has been okay. This one I would say was better paced than the previous one. But there's still issues of it feeling a little bit rushed, and I think maybe that's just partly because they're trying to cram so much in to only 8 episodes. But yes, I mean, there's not a huge amount to say about the storyline, except that I like the idea of Sauron's return, or at least Sauron's influence being felt in more minor ways, like the sword and then the burning of the village and the poisoned grass, rather than just as something big and huge that's currently affecting the world. Again, it plays into that idea of corruption, which I like. So then, I guess, moving on to the Elrond storyline. I've liked this, actually, for the most part. I wasn't entirely sure how it would go. But the idea of bringing up mortality for the elves as a barrier for them to engage with other races was really clever. I thought that was clever. And that also came up with the conversation between Galadriel and the guy on the raft, where the idea of having different perceptions of time, different perceptions of age, was neat. And this is something, again, that is a theme in the Lord of the Rings books, particularly in the Silmarillion. The part of the reason why Númenor fails and Númenor goes over to the darkness is man's fear of death, and the doom of man, the fate of men being to die and move on somewhere else, whereas the fate of the elves is to stick around in Middle-earth basically forever. And that's something actually that I should have mentioned at the beginning. In Tolkien's work, elves don't really die per se. They become remade in the halls of the Valar. So Galadriel's whole motivation of revenge and carrying on the legacy of her brother doesn't make as much sense, because obviously if we're looking at the book version, her brother would just be slowly reforming in the halls of the Valar. But obviously, this universe, the universe of Rings of Power, seems to not be going by those rules, and the Valar themselves don't seem to appear as much, if at all. So, I'm not saying it's wrong for them to change it, but it does feel like that is a fairly major shift from the original series. So yes, the Elrond. I liked the relationship between Elrond and Prince Durin. That was well done. I particularly liked the relationship between Prince Durin and his wife. That was also really fun. And the relationship he had with the kids, that whole scene around dinner was good and understandable. Prince Durin also, he reminds me a lot of Thorin Oakenshield from the book The Hobbit, not so much from the films, in that he's kind of crotchety and grouchy and holds grudges, but also ultimately seems like a fairly decent person at heart. And I think the storyline with the dwarves is going to develop quite a bit going forward as we come to the kind of stinger teaser at the end of that, which very heavily implies the existence of a Silmaril, particularly given that the Silmarils were mentioned in the conversation between Celebrimbor and Elrond. And I was surprised because I wasn't sure whether they'd have the rights to talk about the Silmarils or not, and Feanor, but they do. Clearly. And yeah, I'm kind of interested in what's going to happen there, to be honest, because for those who don't know, the Silmarils, you can look this up on, I'll put a link to the Tolkien Gateway Silmarils page down below, but the Silmarils were jewels made by Feanor, which then get stolen by Morgoth Melkor, the same person, two different names. And they lead then to a big attempt by the Noldor to reclaim them, and this ends up causing all sorts of horrendous misery. Elven civil war, elven genocide, and ultimately leads to the collapse of the elves in Beleriand, and eventually the Valar have to come in and kind of sort everything out, and ultimately the Valar are the ones to defeat Morgoth, not the Noldor. And what's important about that in this context is that there is a storyline around Beren and Luthien, one of the major storylines in the Silmarillion, where effectively an elven king gets hold of a Silmaril. He takes the Silmaril to the dwarves to be set. And this leads to a major quarrel between the elven king and the dwarves. The dwarves kill the elven king, which leads to a war between the elves and the dwarves, which ravages a large part of Beleriand and considerably weakens the ability of the elves to fight against Morgoth later on. This happens towards the end of the Silmarillion. So, obviously, if they're going to kind of bring this up, if there is a Silmaril in Khazad-dûm, it implies that that's going to be a feature of conflict between the elves of Gondolin, the elves of Eregion and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. I don't think it'll be an outright war, although it might be. I think it's more likely that this will be used as the justification for why... spoilers here, by the way. I'm assuming this is going to happen in the series. This is going to be the justification as for why the dwarves won't come to the aid of Eregion when Sauron attacks, which he presumably will do at some point, whether this series or the next series. Because obviously we are now building up to the forging of the rings, and having Elrond take a larger role in that is great, actually. I quite like that. So in that storyline, I guess the only other thing was I do like how it sort of recontextualizes why the dwarves have become so reticent to talk to the elves. Because, again, they've presumably got a Silmaril and they don't want anyone else to know about it. It also ties into a broader theme in both... This series seems to be doing it as well, but certainly in Tolkien more broadly, which is that isolation and very insular societies tend not to end well. It's a broader kind of theme of Tolkien's that this is, it's better to ally with others against a common enemy than to try and just hide yourself away from the world. Because it never actually ends well for those who try that. And I think that's pretty much it. The only thing left to talk about a little bit is some of the visuals. And I will say, again, although there was some visuals in the first episode, particularly when Galadriel is on the ship at the end, that looked a little bit... fake. Let's be honest. For the most part, the visuals have been really quite stunning. Again, some of the backdrops have looked a little fake, but it's also partly worked because this isn't going for as realistic a tone or as realistic a visual style as The Lord of the Rings. So things that occasionally look a bit out of place don't have the same impact as they would have done in a series that was going for a more gritty, realistic tone, like the original Lord of the Rings series. I will say that I'm not a huge fan of the look of Eregion, or Eregion. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce that. It looks too much like Gondor to me. I also never imagined it on a lake. Maybe it's partly because I've played that version. I've been to that area in Lord of the Rings Online, and it doesn't look like that. But also just because that's not at all how it's described in the Lord of the Rings when they go through Hollin. I'm not a huge fan of that. I thought maybe originally it was supposed to be Minas Tirith because of the concentric circles and that sort of thing. But that's a small nitpick. It's similar to my issue with the Malon trees in the previous episode. It's not a big deal. It's just a personal thing. Visually stunning. I'm a big fan of the costumes. Overall, I think the look of the series is great, and the way that the look is contrasted across the different storylines. The more earthy, gritty feel of the storylines with the Harfoots and the storylines with in the Southlands, compared with the more kind of high fantasy storyline of Khazad-dûm and the Elven storyline more generally, it works really well, and I'm quite interested to see where these storylines go. With the stranger, with the with Galadriel being found by the ship again, presumably from Numenor, and of course the other storylines, the development of the Khazad-dûm storyline, particularly will be interesting to see where they go with that and how that ties into the forging of the Rings of Power, which presumably will be the finale of this first season, because that's, it's called the Rings of Power after all. Anyway, that will be it for the second episode. If you are interested in more recaps, please do subscribe, ring the bell, all that jazz. I'll be posting more of these after each one, and if there's interest, I might do a bit more general discussion around the actual the way in which this series has integrated aspects of Tolkien lore into itself. Do longer videos on that kind of thing if there's more interest. So yes, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.